Right. Hello, class. Today the lecture of today's discussion will be about genetically modified organisms, otherwise known as GMOs, GE foods, genetically engineered, or GM foods. So this has been a growing topic in today's contemporary times since the early to mid 1990s, where genetically modified foods were silently introduced into our food systems. We have California is a huge consumer market, so if anything goes on here, it will most likely affect the rest of the nation, as according to Michael Pollan who is a writer, editor for the New York Times, he states that if Proposition 37 does pass in California, the whole nation will catch wind of this and then make judgments based on California. We are a huge consumer market, so anything going on here is most likely going to affect the rest of the nation. Also, California voters need to know what's the most important aspect of this, which I will be going over today the most. First off, I will explain to you why genetically modified food, what the proposition says in genetically modified foods for Proposition 37. Secondly, I will inform you on what the current political battleground is, who's opposing and who's promoting this proposition, and then lastly, I will explain to you. I will explain to you the health effects associated with eating genetically modified foods. So first off, let me explain to you what the Proposition 37 stipulates under its jurisdictions. Proposition 37's guidelines include there will be a number of foods that will be exempt, and there will be a number of foods that will be regarded as having to be labeled. So whether it was genetically modified entirely or partially, there must be a label on the food source. So first off, what is exempt are animal products and dairy products, even if the animal was eating or consuming genetically engineered soybeans or soy crops. That's number one exemption. The second exemption is alcoholic beverages, because alcoholic beverages have their own set of federal laws that guide them, and that's their own jurisdiction. So that's number two. And lastly, foods prepared in restaurants will not have to be labeled, because restaurants don't do that now, and food intended to be eaten immediately after prepared in the restaurant will not need to be labeled. They will not need to carry a label. So that's what is exempt. Now, what gets covered is everything else, from apples to oranges to soy milk and all of the above. According to the United States Department of Agriculture, over 95% of soybeans are genetically engineered here in the United States, and over 85% of corn, otherwise known as maize, is already genetically engineered. So that's a staggering number, considering corn products are in nearly every tortilla chip. They're in Coca-Cola. They're in pretty much basically everything. So that's what needs to be. That's what's been genetically engineered. Also, according to the same Department of the government, Department of Agriculture, over 170 million acres of land is solely dedicated to genetically engineered crops, and we're number one in the world, with Brazil leading with 40 million acres. Now, there's over 400 million acres total in the world dedicated to genetically engineered crops, and that's a staggering number, considering since the 1990s, that number was only about 35 million. Okay. Now that I've explained to you what proposition stipulates under its guidelines, I'm going to explain to you what the current political battleground is considering this proposition. The people who are promoting this proposition is mostly at grassroots level, with organic consumer groups, organic consumers, and organic companies. According to Deborah Bowen, the California Secretary of State, over $1.1 million has been dedicated to promoting this Proposition 37. Now, in contrast, the opposers, who are Monsanto, a big St. Louis company, agricultural, agrochemical, they're all the same, and PepsiCo and Coca-Cola, they're all against this proposition, and they've raised over $45 million to combat passing this proposition. On the other hand, again, people who promote this proposition are California voters, California residents. Over 1 million voter signatures were done in less than a month for this proposition, meaning California voters wanted this proposition in the ballot. So that's the story. Now that I've explained to you what Proposition 37, who are opposing and promoting this proposition, now I'm going to explain to you the known health effects and the unknown health effects for GMOs. First off, let me explain to you what's inside the genetically modified crops that most of us have been consuming. First off, herbicide-resistant crops have a gene inside them that prevents the number one selling herbicide killer named Roundup, also created by Monsanto, to kill them. So, whenever crops are sprayed with the herbicide, they will not die, but instead they're creating super weeds, which will one day, which will not be exterminated from this herbicide. So that's what's consuming, and so that's what consumers are consuming along with their the crops. Second hand, there's BT, which is BT insertion into the genes, which is Bacillus, which stands for Bacillus thuringiensis. And this is a pesticide that kills any insects, so they don't touch it at all. Whenever they eat the genetically modified crop, they die on instant, so they're not touching it. And there's numerous there's numerous studies with conflicting evidence over what the real truth is of the matter. So there's sites saying that this BT and the herbicide-resistant crops actually harm pregnant women and young children, and there's other studies indicating that it's the complete opposite, as in the case with a rat study. According to Dr. Scott Giles Sulami, the lead scientist for this study, they found that when these rats were given 2 years, a lifetime supply of genetically modified corn over a 2-year study, that they found that the female rats had produced mammary tumors in their glands. The males had tumors in their reproductive organs, and the organs that the most damaged was the liver and the kidneys, which process foods and detoxify the body. So those were the most hard hit. And that's one study that gives you a plain overview of what these GM foods may end up happening in the body. So now that I've explained to you the few key aspects of genetically modified foods, I hope you will be informed in deciding what's going to guide you in voting, and don't be swayed by the commercials, because Monsanto has produced many commercials considering opposing this proposition. Thank you very much.